Welcome all, and thank you for joining today's AWRI webinar. My name is Matt Holdstock, and I am an enologist at the AWRI. So in today's session, we'll be looking at using cover crops and landscape features to deliver benefits for wine grape growers. In the spirit of reconciliation, the AWRI acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders in past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'd also like to acknowledge Wine Australia for providing funding and support for webinars via the AWRI Extension Project. Now, before we jump in and make a start, a couple of quick reminders for anyone who's new to the AWRI webinar program. If you'd like to provide a comment or ask a question throughout, then please click on the Q&A button on the Zoom toolbar, type in your question and click to send it through. We will hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but feel free to send in your questions at any stage throughout. A reminder also that this session is being recorded and a link will be sent through to you later today via the AWRI's YouTube channel. We'd also like to collect data today on your knowledge on this topic. So you should see a one-question survey pop onto your screen asking you to rate how much you know about today's topic. If you could please rate your knowledge on this on the scale between 0 and 10 now, with 0 being nothing and 10 being an expert in this topic. And at the conclusion of today's webinar and after the Q&A, we'll prompt you again with another single question to establish your knowledge on the topic after the webinar. Again, you'll be asked to rate your knowledge on a scale between 0 and 10. For anyone who has just joined, welcome. Today's webinar topic is using cover crops and landscape features to deliver benefits for wine grape growers. And it's great pleasure today to welcome Professor Jeff Gurr. Professor Gurr is well known internationally for his work on applied ecology, following doctoral training at Imperial College and the National Institute of Agricultural Botany in Cambridge. His work over the last 3 decades has focused on developing ecologically based strategies to harmonise agriculture with the environment. He's held faculty positions at Melbourne, New England, Sydney and Charles Sturt universities, as well as visiting professor positions at Sydney University, Lincoln University in New Zealand, and Zhejiang University and Fujian Agricultural and Forestry University in China. Jeff has been elected to Fellowship of the Royal Entomological Society and the Royal Society of New South Wales. So Jeff, if you're ready to make a start, I'll hand over to you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Matt. Thanks AWRI for inviting me to be part of your seminar series, and thanks to the audience. I hope you find this interesting. So I won't repeat the title of the presentation, but you can get the sense from this title that I'm an ecologist and very interested in how ecology can help to deliver some tangible benefits to growers. Hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll think that there is perhaps scope to realise some of these benefits. So let's get into the meat of the presentation. So the work I'll show to you has been a part of a Wine Australia funded project on functional biodiversity. And functional biodiversity is really talking about things that matter, so effects that have a consequence, and so potentially we can generate benefit from this. And the 2 main kind of activities in the project are to better understand what ground cover vegetations within vineyards can do for you. And the second is to understand the effects, whether positive or negative, of the adjacent and surrounding landscape, around the vineyards. So I'll take you through that. And what I'll try to illustrate is that potentially we can generate benefits for all 3 of these major types of pest. The weeds, the pest plants, pathogens that cause plant diseases, and of course pest animals like caterpillars. And the main structure of the presentation, to give you a kind of a heads up, is I'll take you through 3 major methodological planks of the project about the field trials, some associated laboratory results, and then last a landscape scale survey. Okay, so with these field trials, they took place in vineyards around the Orange District, and they involved testing a couple of different approaches. The first is to put plants directly underneath a vine, and the second is putting plants in the mid-row. And in those pictures, you can see a couple of our treatments. One is called a plant called alyssum, and the second's a slightly more familiar plant, buckwheat. And the design of the work was relatively simple. So we had plants established underneath a row of vines, and that, of course, was used for sampling the vines themselves for later effects. And in the mid-row trials, we had the plant treatments established either row of that central vines that was used for sampling. And in the inspections of the vines, we found lots of evidence of biodiversity that potentially could exert biological control of our pests. And a couple of the interesting critters that we found in the vineyards were these eggs here, laid on their stalks. These are lacewing eggs. And this grapevine moth caterpillar here has got these pearl-like eggs on the back of its neck, which have been put there by a parasitoid insect. You'll be hearing some more about parasitoids a bit later on in this talk. And there's one of its fellow caterpillars that's being killed by a viral disease. Okay, let's start looking at some actual results then, because it's important in studies like this that we get down to some tangible and quantifiable effects rather than just vague hand-waving about how wonderful biodiversity might be. In this study, we found that biodiversity really can deliver benefits. And this first slide here is showing numbers of bunches at the end of the season that were attacked by, attacked by light brown apple moth. And just to kind of cut through the complexity of these graphics here, the control treatment here, shown in the green for both our Angulong vineyard and for our Balmoral vineyard, these are where the existing vegetation was retained, and that's our kind of reference point. And you can see that we found in both those vineyards relatively high levels of light brown apple moth damage to our bunches. I say relatively high, I mean in comparison with the equivalent values for the treatments in which the ground cover have been replaced by these plants like alyssum, a mix of native plants, or a special blend that was called the seesaw blend. So evidence here that the nature of the ground cover in the vineyard can have an effect on this very important pest of light brown apple moth. The reason for this, of course, and many of you will be aware of this, is that these plants that we're putting in are very rich sources of nectar, and nectar is used as flight fuel by parasitoid insects. So things like this wasp here, they'll feed on nectar, and that gives them a calorie boost, a sugar rush, if you like, and then they can go out and find more pests and parasitize more pests and potentially exert useful levels of biological control, as we see happening here. Now, the other major type of pest in this system, of course, is the weedy plants. And here I'm showing you just a snapshot of the extent to which those sown plants provided coverage. The green bar again is our control, and so obviously that's a 0 because there's none of the added plants in those treatments. But you can see perhaps for these ones here that I've ringed in red, they're getting up to around half, maybe 3/4 ground coverage of those sown plants within the first season of them being established. And reflecting that, at least on some sites, we're seeing significant levels of suppression of the weedy plants that are there. Now, I'm not going to try and kid you that that was easy to get them established or that weed suppression was complete, because this remains one of our major challenges in using ground covers in vineyards. More on that later. But what was very striking with these plants that we added to the field trials, and in this case we're looking at the undervine treatment plants, is that they are all very much shorter than the plants they are replacing. So our control treatment here, you can see those plants, the weedy things that spontaneously grow, are getting up to around 0.5 metre in height. But these various plants that we trialled beneath the vines are growing very much shorter, particularly some of these native plants here, Viola and Pretiosum. And this is useful, of course, because it increases the scope for airflow underneath the the vine plants, and that can reduce humidity, which has a knock-on benefit for reducing vulnerability to some fungal plant diseases that like humid conditions. And early in the season, that free draining kind of effect can be useful in reducing frost risk. So moving along and talking now about actual hard evidence of suppression of pathogens. And these graphics here show you incidence of botrytis on the bunches just before harvest. And you can see perhaps here that if you compare the control treatment, where botrytis severity was pretty high, the corresponding means for the other treatments, where you've replaced the weeds with these ground covers, were somewhat lower. The same, but perhaps not quite so pronounced at the second vineyard, Balmoral. The reason for this, we believe, is that if you think back to the effects I showed you a couple of slides previously on light brown apple moth, some of these plants reduce damage by LBAM on the bunches. And many of you would be aware that when a bunch is heavily attacked by light brown apple moth, the caterpillars, their feeding activity can cause wounds that are prime sites for the spores of botrytis to colonize the bunch and lead on to botrytis bunch rot. So what we're seeing here in this control of botrytis is a knock-on benefit of reduced light brown apple moth density. Okay, so look, on this little panel here, this is our navigation tab. And as you can see, we're moving on now to talk about laboratory results. And the main insect type that we studied here was another group of parasitoids called Trichogramma wasps. Now, parasitoids are basically insects that will lay their immatures inside or on the body surface of another insect, in this context, hopefully a pest. And when those young parasitoids hatch out, they'll consume the tissues of their host, somewhat like the aliens in the famous Alien movie series. And when they complete their development, it kills the host, and then the adults that emerge do the same thing again to produce the next generation. Now, if you want to point your phone at that QR code there, it'll take you to a YouTube clip, which you might find interesting. It's not one from our study, but it's a very nice clip of the life cycle of these parasitoids. And so if that's your thing, then have a look. But suffice to say that in this study, we're looking at a particular group of parasitoids called Trichogramma. Now, they're not actually visible in this slide, are they? And that's because they're rather small. They're about the size of a full stop on a printed page. So nothing like a European wasp or a paper wasp, anything like this. They're minute and completely harmless to us, but quite deadly to insects. And this is just giving you a glance at the setup that we used for testing different species of Trichogramma against different species of plants, from which potentially they can obtain nectar and live longer and parasitize more pests. I won't step you through this, but you can get some more information about this on the link that I'll show you at the end of the presentation. So these laboratory tests are just a way of assessing how good various candidate plant species are for supporting these beneficial Trichogramma wasps. Now, this slide here is a bit busy and complex, so don't freak out. I'll just point out to you a couple of the key results in here. So our reference point in these laboratory studies was how well these wasps performed when you gave them honey solution, because they love honey solution. This is, you know, like a lolly shop for them, and they do very well on the honey solution. And our negative control is this one down here, which is just plain water that kind of keeps them alive for a while, but doesn't give them any nutritional benefit. So there are reference points. And the question is then, if you give them access to shoots of a given plant, like this one here, Myoporum, does their performance look a bit like water, or does it look a bit like honey? And what you can see here, perhaps slightly confusingly, that there are two bars. One's very low down like water, one's very high, like the honey. The reason for that, it's not an accident, it's part of our design, is that we had two separate treatments. One where the insects had access to a shoot of this plant where the flower was intact, and the second one is another type of control, and it's where the shoot had the flower removed. So it still had the same kind of environment with the smell of the foliage and things like this. The only difference being, of course, that in these yellow, sorry, I should say more pinky or pale purple coded bars, we're seeing here the benefit of the insects having access to nectar in comparison with access just to the foliage. So we can infer from this, they really are feeding on the nectar, and it's the nectar doing the job. And we can see here this next one over, Phagopyrum, that's the scientific name of buckwheat. And we can see that again, if the flower's intact, they do really well on this one. Interestingly, and perhaps contrary to what some people might expect, not all the natives were great. So an example there perhaps is Kunzia, and whether it had access to a flower or not, the insects, the beneficial Trichogramma, did really poorly. And indeed they did also for these acacia species. So this is a way of, in the laboratory, rapidly screening lots of different plant species to see if they might be useful either as a ground cover in the case of very short plants, or in perhaps vineyard adjacent plantings if they're taller, like these trees that I've mentioned. Okay, so that's a snapshot of what happens with Trichogramma. And just a quick glance then at the other side of the coin. There's no point in putting these plants into a vineyard if they're going to support and promote key pests like light brown apple moth. And so we did similar tests to those that I've described for Trichogramma, but this time with the moth to see if it was benefiting from the nectar. And indeed, we found that while some of these plants, and I've listed a few here, are really good, they were safe because they didn't benefit the moth. Others, like Trifolium spimosum, would be a really bad choice because they really help light brown apple moth have a high level of fecundity. They produce lots of eggs when they've got access to those flowers. Okay, so that's enough about field work. Let's return to the field. And this shot here is of my co-worker, Dr. Jian Liu, using a customized leaf blower, a garden leaf blower from Bunnings, but it's been customized to be a rapid way of sampling insects from vines. And this was one of the key methods that we used to try and understand some of the larger scale effects of what happens in a vineyard in response to vegetation that might be growing just over the fence or perhaps a little bit more remote. So I'll take you through some of the findings here from this third major part of our project, the landscape survey. Now, the picture here that I've borrowed from the internet isn't one of our sites. I just picked it because it was a nice illustration of the fact that if you look at an individual vineyard block, it might be bordered, and I'm talking here about the immediately adjacent vegetation, by various different things. It might have an extensive grassy headland, it might have another vineyard block against one corner, or it might have timber, woody vegetation along one side. And the question in this part of our investigation was, well, does that matter? Does it actually have a bearing on the numbers of beneficial insects in the vineyard? So that's where that vacuum sampling that I showed you on the previous slide came in. And the major findings that we found from this is that the natural enemies, these beneficial insects and other arthropods, were dominated by spiders and parasitoid wasps. And by now, you'll all know what I mean by a parasitoid wasp. So these were the dominant types of natural enemies in vineyards, but they were relatively scarce in the center of vineyards. If you take a vacuum sample here, you'll tend to find very many fewer insects, beneficial insects that is, compared to the sample taken in the more border-lying edge areas of a vineyard. And the reason for this is that these adjacent habitats might provide important resources like shelter or perhaps nectar. So let's look at some actual hard data here. This graphic is for the total counts of natural enemies, NEs, natural enemies. And what you can see is that things like water bodies, perennial horticulture and grassland do have a promoting effect on the numbers of natural enemies in the adjacent areas of a vineyard. But the land uses that mattered most and that dramatically enhanced numbers of these beneficials was a category that we term narrow linear non-crop vegetation. That's a bit of a mouthful, but it was a pooled category to cover things like riparian vegetation growing along watercourses, shelter belts, and also roadways that had woody vegetation growing along the side. So where you've got a feature like this, the adjacent vineyard is going to enjoy a beneficial spillover effect of more natural enemies. But that's then talking about the immediately adjacent vegetation or land use. What about the larger scale effects? Well, so here we used a suite of techniques, including GIS, Geographical Information Systems analyses, to try and understand what happens to the density in the middle of the vineyard, so not where the edge effects are occurring, but in the central part of the vineyard. What happens there as a consequence of the nature of the landscape at this much larger scale of 5 kilometers? And again, I've just nicked this slide from the internet because it looks pretty, but it does show quite nicely the kind of nature of our interest. So if we're considering numbers of natural enemies in this vineyard here, we know from that earlier piece of work that it might be affected by the nature of the immediately adjacent land use. But does it matter that we've got a little area of built infrastructure here? Does it matter we've got a watercourse down here? Does it matter that a couple of kilometers away, we've got a very extensive area of woodland in this shot here? Well, the answer is, from our research, from surveying 30-odd vineyards across New South Wales over the course of 2 years, is that yes, that larger scale effect can be quite strong. So in this rather colourful graphic here, this is a categorization of different land uses, they're coded by colour, of course, around a vineyard. That's the vineyard there in pink in the middle, and this area around here is 5 kilometers distant. And you can see that within this 5 kilometer scale radius, we've got some other vineyards, we've got grasslands, we've got woodland, we've got watercourses and so on. So what do those do? Well, to try and understand this, we used an approach called Bayesian network analysis, and you don't need to understand that. I've just mentioned it in case any of the audience here are data nerds and get excited by this sort of thing. But it's a way of analysing quite complex data sets to understand the functional linkage between various things. I could perhaps take some questions on that if anyone wants to ask me. But to cut to one of the main findings here, it seems that the numbers of natural enemies in a vineyard are maximized if that vineyard is in a landscape where, to that scale of 5 kilometers away, the land uses are dominated by a category that is just called a shorthand here, agri-production. This is annual crops and pastures. So it's distinct from other land uses like water bodies and built infrastructure, vineyards, perennial horticulture, and so on. So this was one of the most powerful signals that we got from the Bayesian network analysis, that the larger the proportion of the land around your vineyard that's allocated to grasslands or annual crops, the larger the proportion, the more likely you are to enjoy large numbers of natural enemies in your vineyard, compared with vineyards that have relatively modest amounts of that land use in the surrounding landscape. Of course, in a project like this, we're not necessarily able to nail down every emergent question, but in terms of why that might be, we think the main answer is that those categories of land use, annual crops and pastures, tend to have relatively high levels of disturbance. Tillage, sowing, harvesting, pesticide spraying, or mowing and grazing events, of course, in the case of a pasture. And all of those things are likely to make the natural enemies that are in there think, hang on a minute, life's getting a bit too tough and disruptive here, I'm moving. And so if the vineyard is nearby, that might offer a safe harbour for those disrupted natural enemies to settle. And so vineyards are basically enjoying a donor effect when the natural enemies move from, say, a crop of wheat or a hay paddock that's being mowed. The natural enemies will relocate into a vineyard. And of course, many of those natural enemies, things like spiders and predatory beetles, are generalists. And so they're quite happy consuming the pests that trouble vineyards. So that's potentially good news. Okay, so last couple of slides now before I take questions. To sum things up in relation to our overall findings, what we found is that several plant species produced nectar that promoted beneficial wasps and denied benefit to one of our major pests, the light brown apple moth. So those laboratory studies were useful in that we've now got a body of information that extends across several different plant species that in some cases are suitable for putting in the vineyard as a ground cover. In other cases, the bigger plants, they could be put into a shelter belt or an insectary planting, something like this, near the vineyard. Secondly, our field trials were successful in showing that these ground covers potentially can do great things for the system. They can suppress light brown apple moth. There was also a knock-on effect for botrytis. And in the more vigorous of these ground cover treatments, they were able to a good degree to exclude weeds. Plus, there were shorter growing plants that can provide benefits in relation to airflow underneath the vine vegetation. Third point, though, is a very important practical one. We found that these ground covers can be costly and hard to establish. And so this remains, I think, one of the major, not exactly stumbling blocks, but future challenges for us to be able to better establish these plants by use of specialized machinery, and perhaps some better ways to control the vegetation in organic systems. So the ground covers that we're adding can get a good strike and take off rapidly in their first year. The fourth point is that vineyard adjacent vegetation, and especially if it's linear non-crop vegetation, can promote the densities of beneficial insects and spiders in vineyards. And then fifth, annual crops and pastures in the wider landscape at that really big scale, 5 kilometres, they will promote the numbers of beneficials in our vineyard. Now, the value of that, I think, extends beyond just being able to identify what constitutes a high and a low risk site. So, for example, what I mean by a low risk site is a vineyard in a landscape with lots of annual crops and pastures, plus it has linear non-crop vegetation that extends to the edge of the vineyard. And this provides kind of like a movement corridor or a superhighway, if you like, that the natural enemies can move through and reach the vineyard. So that's what I mean by a high and low risk site. But it does go, I think, beyond there, because it means that with the benefit of that knowledge, we're able to potentially implement some management techniques to exploit those effects. So, for example, if you were to add things like a shelter belt or a hedgerow type thing alongside the edge of a vineyard, that would be useful. And especially so if it was serving to link the vineyard up to areas more remote in the landscape that were things like annual crops. Okay, so I think a final graphic here to summarize things. Potentially what we're seeing here is scope for benefits in relation to weeds, especially if those plants that we're putting in are really dense, competitive and perennial plants. which might be difficult to establish initially, but if they're perennial, once you've done that, they're then there for many years. In relation to the animal pests, we found strikingly good effectiveness against light brown apple moth, and that actually had a flow-on effect to controlling botrytis on the bunches at the end of the season. Now, if you want some more information, you can point your phone at that QR code there, and it'll take you to a website where we've put some information about this work. And the final report that we've submitted to Wine Australia will be available very soon. Just very briefly before I wrap up then, I want to talk about next steps. And Wine Australia, who funded the work that I've shown you, have now awarded additional funding to have a study specifically on scale insects. And you can see some scale insects here, perhaps especially if I zoom in, and these pests can assume really quite large densities. And in the fieldwork that Gianni is conducting, literally as I speak, she's out down in the Griffith area surveying vineyards, even with growers who think they don't have a problem with scales or have never seen scales in their vineyard, are surprised when Gian shows them pictures that she's just taken in their blocks. So at the end of this additional phase of the work, in about 12 months' time, we'll know a lot more about the identity of the various scale insects in different parts of New South Wales, their severity and their density and their life cycle, but also their potential natural enemies, things like parasitoids, and finally the effects on those parasitoids of ground covers and other vegetation. Okay, thanks for listening. That's me done, but I'll try and take any questions.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great. There have been a couple of questions come through, so I'll just remind everyone if they do have any questions, just type them into the Q&A section at the bottom of the toolbar there, and just press enter, and they'll come through. So the first question that's come through is, hi Jeff, any thoughts on species for perennial species for possibly undervine use and competing with weeds?
Yeah. All right. So are my PowerPoint slides still visible? If I scroll back, can you see those? Doesn't matter. No, doesn't matter. So yes, look, there are a good number of perennial species. Things like Myoporum is a really good example that are readily available as planting stock, grow to around 20 centimeters in height or shorter, and seem to go quite well in vineyards, quite competitive, and do provide benefits for natural enemies. So if you follow that link on that QR code thing, or what else? Email me. I can send you a sneak peek at the final report to Wine Australia that hasn't quite been published, but it's not too far away from being publicly available. But yes, I think perennial ground covers are a great way to go.
I'll just mention with the links that you've put in your presentation there, Jeff, we'll provide those links in the email that'll come out to everyone later this afternoon, so people will be able to access them. Okay, the next question is, looks like a two-part question. The first one is, how dense or close throughout a vineyard would a corridor planted area need to be planted within a vineyard to be able to reach a level of self-control of beneficial insects to outcompete pests? And the second part is, are there any large 80 hectares or bigger vineyards that don't use light brown apple moth sprays?
Okay, so for the first part of that question, I think the short answer is we don't know, because in the project that wasn't one of our core objectives to look at the kind of density of planting necessary to achieve block-wide control. But I can tell you from other studies that we conducted in vegetable crops that you tend to find a decay effect, a diminution of natural enemies and resulting pest control over the scale of about 25 meters. So this would mean that if your sole focus was to try and get good control of insect pests and those knock-on benefits to botrytis, you could probably get away with having a strip of these nectar plants every 5 rows or so. In fact, no more than that, because the plant resources would be either side of the unplanted area. So perhaps 50 meters apart would be sufficient. But that said, if you want to get additional benefits, like controlling the undervine weeds, they don't get too tall, or if you were interested in things like stabilizing the soil and alleviating erosion, which I haven't talked about today, but they're, of course, widely valued benefits of ground covers in vineyards, then you'd need to try and get this established over the entire block. And I think that's probably easiest done before you put in all the trellis work and the vines themselves. You can go in there with a blank sheet approach. That's the easiest way of perhaps getting that really comprehensive establishment across the whole block. The second question there was about whether any of the really large vineyards around the country are able to function effectively without light brown apple moth sprays. And I think the answer is yes, because light brown apple moth tends to be most serious in the cooler districts. And so if you move out west, well, that's west from Orange, into perhaps like the Riverina, then many of those areas won't be troubled significantly by light brown apple moth, and so they won't be spraying for that. Most of their sprays will be for fungal diseases.
Jeff, there's been a comment put in the Q&A section. You probably could see it as well, regarding. So it says in New Zealand, I'm assuming that means buckwheat or buckwheat is being used every 10 rows for use with another parasitoid on light brown apple moth, larger wasps.
Yeah.
And assuming 3-meter rows.
Yeah, so that work was led by Steve Ratton, a dear old friend of mine. And so he and I did a lot of work going back almost 20 years now on different options. And it's fair to say that the New Zealand growers have been a lot more receptive and, what you might call early adopters of this approach. So they've been able to kind of develop these protocols, that relate back to the first question that I took about, how wide can the rows be? They developed these protocols, which might be useful as some sort of guidance for us, although the identity of the leaf roller pests and their natural enemies is a little bit different, compared with us.
There hasn't been any more questions come through. So what we might do is we might wrap it up there. So look, thanks again, Jeff. I think that was a great presentation this morning on using cover crops and landscape features and showing what benefits there are for wine grape growers here in Australia. I'm sure everyone got a lot out of the session, and I'd just like to remind the audience or thank the audience for logging in and taking part, and also remind that, as always, you will receive a link this afternoon to a recording of this presentation, and we'll include some of the website links and the QR codes that Jeff's provided through his presentation in that as well. The next Undervine webinar is on Thursday, August 31. This is where Dr. Marty Longbottom from Adderall will run through the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia dataset for 2023. So if you'd like to register for this one, please visit the Adderall website. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you
survey thing
at the next Adderall webinar. Sorry, Jeff, what was that?
I just wondering if you were doing that little survey thing again at this end of the talk.
Yes, we have. We've already done that. We've done that already. And
have you? Oh, I missed that. Great. Well done.
That's all right. We'll provide some data for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining, and thanks again for you coming along today, Jeff.
Pleasure.